Hey, you.
Hey, nice to see you, Mary.
Me too. I like your scarf.
I had to match the cover.
So welcome to the Cambridge Common Writers book launch for Blue Desert by Celia Jeffries. I'm Michael Mercurio. I'm the Executive Director of Cambridge Common Writers. We are an alumni association for graduates of the Lesley Low Residency MFA program in creative writing. And our mission, to put it simply, is to brag about what our alums are doing and to build the alumni network that we all enjoyed as students, and to make sure that our experience carries on for the rest of our lives. It's a tall order, but it's also a lot of fun to work with my alumni colleagues on this, and it's a great privilege to be able to have ringside seats for book launches by our incredible alums. On that note, I am going to hand things over to Virginia Ryan, who is going to introduce our reader for tonight, and we will have an opportunity for some conversation and question and answer after Celia has finished her reading.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. So welcome to the Cambridge Commons Writers celebration of the launch of Celia's new book, Blue Desert. I want to welcome Celia and all of you. As some of you know, Janet Pokarova was going to be joining Celia tonight to talk about the art of revision, but unfortunately, Janet had a rough reaction to her second vaccine today. So she can't be on the call, but thank goodness she's not going to get COVID. So we hope that we can have a conversation later in the program about our own experiences with revision. And we'll fill Janet in later on. So onto the program, I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about our featured author. I was fortunate to meet Celia through our beloved Lesley mentor, Hester Kaplan. During the pandemic, we participated in workshops taught by Hester and the author Ann Hood through Goat Hill Writers. And in between readings and critiques, I learned all sorts of fascinating things about Celia. She somehow managed to get a degree from Lesley in fiction and creative nonfiction at the same time. I want to hear how she did that. She's a former Peace Corps volunteer. She lives in Weston, Massachusetts, and she's a gifted writer. Her work has appeared in numerous newspapers and literary magazines, including Westview, Solstice Literary Magazine, and Puerto del Sol, as well as the anthology Beyond the Yellow Wallpaper. She has received grants from Turkey Land Cove Foundation, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and Muse. Before studying at Lesley, Celia received an MA from Brandeis University and worked in news and educational publishing. She's worked with writers at all levels, from elementary school to university, both here and abroad, and in many different communities, including the incarcerated, literacy, and ESL programs. She's on the steering committee of Straw Dog Writers Guild, and she offers workshops at Pioneer Valley Writers. And so that's Celia. I'm sure I missed some things, but maybe you'll fill us in on those later on as we talk. But before you do your reading, could you tell us a little bit about what's the story behind this story? And then maybe you'll share some pages with us.
The first line that I ever wrote that I would say was this story was in response. I was taking a writing workshop and we were doing prompts, and I was writing in response to a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. And the first line that I wrote was, "I am 1,000 miles from home." So for me, I knew, for some reason, I knew it was an older woman speaking and she was looking back. And it was just, a 15-minute writing and da-da-da. And then the rest of the story, I sometimes say it was like, a stray cat that keeps showing up at the door. This voice kept showing up when I would be writing. And don't want to sound like somebody with voices in their head, but that's what writers sometimes are. And I would just keep following this voice and this character. And eventually, it became a story that became a big baggy monster of a story that I had to work on. And that was actually what Janet and I were going to talk about tonight, was revision. And Janet said she spent 15 years writing her book, The Fourth String. And I think I beat her. I took a little longer to write The Blue Desert, but that wasn't 9 to 5, 20 years, but that was going back and forth. Sometimes I'd put it away for a couple of years. Sometimes I went back to it. But that original line I thought was long gone in the revision process. And when I was doing the final proof for this book, there was that line in the middle of the book. So it was still there. So I think what I would like to do for reading is just to read a bit of the opening. And the biggest revision problem or challenge that I had was the point of view, because this story began as an older woman looking back, and it was told from her point of view and very much in her head. And that's, of course, if you're in first person point of view, it's like wearing blinders. You can't see the rest of the world and what's going on. So I finally, after many false starts and many drafts, I'm actually telling this story in 2 points of view. I'm telling it from the main character, Alice's point of view, and in first person as she remembers things and as she tells them, and also in third person point of view of the people around her as they hear the story and try to figure out for themselves. So it takes place in 2 time periods, 1910 in Morocco, London and Morocco, and 1970 when Alice is remembering or is forced to remember, which you will see from the opening. So, London, June 6, 1970. I wish for once the post would land upright in the box. Martin bends over to retrieve the day's missives. He's an exact man, neat to a fault. His pens and pencils line up on his desk, and papers are always sorted and piled like an oversized millefeuille. Anything for me, Alice calls. Everything for you, my love, Martin says. I don't want everything, she laughs. You may keep the bills. He smiles and walks over to hand her a heavy cream envelope. Oh, Lord, spare us, she whispers, an invitation to the Hobsons. Martin shakes his head. June is fast upon us, he says. Garden party, no doubt. Everyone is competing with Buckingham Palace. Alice begins to rip the edge of the envelope. She sees Martin purse his lips and tosses him a wide smile, then moves nimbly over to his desk and picks up his letter knife. She slips the ivory-handled spear under the flap. She doesn't have to look up to know that his shoulders, which had seized a bit when she began to tear at the envelope, have now relaxed as she makes a clean slice through the vellum and pulls out the printed invitation. Indeed, she says in her most impressive House of Commons voice. The Harris Hobsons request the honor of our presence in the patch of lawn they have stuffed with roses and vicious dahlias. Martin laughs. No doubt we are busy on that date. No doubt, Alice says. She turns as Martin holds out a yellow envelope. What is that? A telegram for you. Martin hands it to her, still smiling as she slips her finger under the envelope's flap, pulls out the yellow page and unfolds it. He watches as she goes completely still. He stood in the entrance to the tent, his back to the dry wind. He squeezed his eyes as he peered into the dark interior. I was crouching in the far corner of the octagonal space, my white skirts fluttering against the red and green of the unfolded carpets, like the flag of a surrendering army. Although the tent had been standing for 24 hours, the air was thick with the fragrance of juniper branches. From the entrance to my corner was only a few strides. I knew once his eyes adjusted to the light, he would see that the blankets and pouches had been strewn about, and a line of defense had been set up with the large seating pillows. Behind him, the tent flaps inhaled and exhaled slowly, like a tense beast. The man sat down in the shadows of the tent and stared at me. He was nothing but a pair of eyes, fabric, yards and yards of fabric, and a pair of eyes, stone blue. The longer he stared at me, the darker they became. He did not seem to blink, nor did he seem to breathe. He was a heap of cloth with a pair of eyes above. The fabric didn't move, not a rustle. It was so still in the tent and warm. I dared not blink. He was too quiet. He was waiting for something. He was waiting for me. It was so warm in there. My feet ached. My body was heavy. We had been walking for so long before the driver met this man. I dared not blink. He was still staring. Now his eyes were black, black sparkles beneath the turban, black sparkles above the blue cloth. I dared not blink. I dared not move. I must be as still as he was. Hours seemed to pass. He got up and left the tent. I collapsed into sleep. Alice, are you all right? Martin is standing at the door staring at me. I lift my head and listen to the words leaving my mouth. Yes, I am all right, I say, as he crosses the carpet towards me. What is this, he says, pointing to the telegram. It is not for you, I say, and see the alarm in his eyes. It is not for you, I repeat, and sit down, then fold the paper into my lap. You have no color and your hands are trembling. He pulls out the chair beside me and lowers himself into it, then puts his warm hand over mine and softens his voice. What is the news? Abu has died in the desert. Who is Abu? My lover, I say, surprising myself as much as him. So these are the opening 3 pages, and I've moved from third person to interior monologue to first person. And at this point, Alice now goes back into her memories, and we move back from 1970 to 1910. And I'll just read a short section of this. Devon, England, 1910. I was 16 years old, told I was possessed of a dangerous will when life unhinged its jaws for me. We are moving to Morocco, father announced, all 5 of us, mother, father, Edith, James, and me. Just in time, I thought. I knew mother was already casting her eyes about for a suitable mate. Dances and dinners were definitely on the horizon. Mother entered the room holding a piece of paper in front of her. More news from the ministry, she said. Any trousers that provide a wide range of movement are acceptable. Gauzy material is best, something the air can pass through, but nothing the eye can see through. She read the description without comment. Trousers were for men only. The idea that women would wear them was quite startling. Mother continued to read to herself, then explained that the trousers were actually undergarments, that a long robe-like dress called a halaba was worn over the trousers, and a large piece of material was wrapped around the head and face. Where is the woman? Edith asked. We were staring at a picture of the outfit being described. Inside the material, I said. Inside all that material, see? The eyes are showing. Must be hot. Well, I don't know about that, I said. It doesn't say anything about corsets, and the material is light. It looks like they are floating inside it. It looks hard to walk in, Edith said. Mother laughed. You don't have to worry about that. We won't dress that way. Only the natives dress that way. She leaned over and patted our heads. We'll dress the way we've always dressed. Something in my chest sank at her words. The way we always dressed was cumbersome and hot and as far from floating as one could imagine. And from there, she moves in. We arrive in Morocco, and there's many passages on what Morocco is like. And then we move 2 years later to when she enters the desert. I don't know if you have any questions at this
Yes.
point.
So, I mean, when we talked about doing this program, we were really going to focus on revision, and the structure that you've created works. I mean, it was very easy to follow, but how was that to write? I mean,
Not easy.
did you have this idea in your head? I mean, when you started writing it, it sounds, from your initial remarks, it sounded like, you were writing scenes or maybe short stories about this character and this possible situation. And so how did you have a vision from the beginning of how this would all work? Or did you start down one path and then end up making, this beautiful tapestry of different voices and perspectives and time periods? How did that all unfold for you?
It was like walking through a maze and, hitting a dead end and turning around and coming back. And basically, because I wasn't someone who had the whole story in my head to begin with, I was really character driven. I really sort of understood this character from the beginning, and I just followed her. And I knew that it was somebody looking back, and I was surprised when I ended up in the Sahara with her. So I would just follow these passages with her in certain ways. And it wasn't until I had a sense of the beginning and the end that I really had to, and I struggled because my initial impulse was to follow a person's memory. And I really wanted to play with what's real, what's not real, because memory is so mutable. And I really had at the beginning a rather unreliable narrator, because when I was writing and people were reading, it was like, well, can we believe her? Is this old lady making these stories up or whatever? And I played with that for quite a while. And then finally, nobody liked that, or most of my readers, where it's too confusing. And once I had, but the other thing I was playing with was the fact that when she returned home after 5 years in the desert, she had to keep her memories to herself. And coming back from that world, nobody in her old world had changed dramatically, because she went into the desert in 1912, and while she was in the desert, the entire world order changed in World War I. So she not only returned to a life with no upstairs, downstairs, or any of that, but a family that had been fractured by the war, and a family that thought she was too wacky and weren't going to believe anything she said anyway. So a part of the story was, how does a person live with these memories, and how do these memories drive people with secrets? Actually, how do they drive a person, a character? So it wasn't a long-winded way to answer your question, but no, I didn't have a sense of how to weave it at the beginning. And it wasn't until I actually had the character of Martin, then I knew where I was, what the trajectory was going to be. And the story I actually told, she's having her memories, but Martin has a lot of contacts in the government, and he begins to investigate. So we hear the story as she remembers it, and we hear the story as he uncovers it. So we have two different ways to get this story.
Did you have, so when you, in the writing process, did it take some like super confidence or bravery to sort of push beyond, sort of a traditional structure, in terms of, just changing the voices, where some people encouraging you to try and, do it all in, one voice, or, one particular voice, or like, how did that feel? Did that unnerve you?
Yes. And it's interesting because since we're talking about Lesley and the MFA program, I brought my story to the MFA program, and I thought, oh, I'm going to do these 2 years and I'm going to finish my book. And I was quickly disabused of that. I was not going to get this book done in 2 years. And I'm very sorry that Wayne Brown is no longer with us, because he was my mentor at Lesley, my first one. And he read just a few pieces of it. And I'll never forget, he came up to me outside with this deep voice with his, Jamaican accent. And he said, "Don't let anybody tell you what to do with this story." And so I kept that in my head. And then I had the great fortune of working with Hester Kaplan, and she was very clear-sighted about things. And I worked and this answers you. Also, I was spending time doing some creative nonfiction too. So I kept Wayne's voice in the back of my head. And this isn't the story I set out to tell, but I moved forward and backward in time, even though a lot of people didn't think I should. And and that's where I'm kind of sorry that Janet wasn't able to be with us, because she talked about writing about her experience in Japan. She was writing a memoir that was very much in the voice of Japan. We're used to memoirs where people quote spill their guts or tell everything, and you would never do that in Japan. And I was told by people who read this from the Middle East that the gaps and the movements in time are very much the way they think and work in the middle in Eastern countries. So maybe I was channeling, I don't know.
Yeah, so along those lines, so and I was curious, I would have asked Janet this as well. A couple of weeks ago, I attended the Grub Street's Muse conference, and in one of the presentations, the authors were suggesting that when you're writing about people from cultures different from yours, to get sensitivity readers. Did you do anything along those lines as part of your revision to show this to other people to get their perspective?
Not until the very end. I did a lot of reading and research, read lots of novels written at that time period and in that place. And then when I was down to what I would call the final revision, I did have someone vet the Arabic language and read it for that. And it was actually an Israeli woman. And she knew the Tuaregs. She knew that culture. So that was very helpful. So I've not heard it before. Sensitivity reading
sensitivity is what you reader. Yeah. Sensitivity reader. Yeah.
I kind of shied away from that, because I actually had a couple of readers, and I've been working on it for so long. There's a line in here where when they're arriving in 1910, and the British mother, refers to the people on the wharf as heathens. And somebody said, "Oh no, you shouldn't say that. It's 1910. That's what they said in 1910. So I think we can get a little lost sometimes in our correctness. So I was glad I did have somebody read it to vet all of that, but not particularly to impose 19 or 2021 values on a 1910 story.
So if anybody has any questions, chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I know of sensitivity readings primarily for children's books, and especially for librarians and for the library market. But I haven't heard about it too much with adult books, especially with fiction. But there are those people out there.
Yeah.
So that's actually a career now?
Yeah, you can embark on that next.
I don't think I'm sensitivity person. Yeah.
No, I think that the way it was described, I think you hire somebody from another culture, another race, another religion, to read, to see if you've got it right, if you're being offensive at all. And
oh no, that definitely makes
reality.
sense. Yeah.
So for you, What was the most challenging part of revision, or was there a particular section of this that you really struggled with?
It took me what I struggled with is nobody wanted to leave, my readers didn't want to leave the desert. And I had a frame story, it takes place in London 1910 and London 1970. And people just didn't like the 1970s part. They wanted to stay in the desert, which was very flattering because that might help understand why Alice stayed in the desert for 5 years. So that was a struggle until, as I said, I got the character of Martin. And then I got I got a sense of Alice's, what she had preserved for herself in her older age and in her marriage with Martin.
Do you have another section you want to read?
Sure. I guess I will read when she actually enters the desert. So this is Marrakech 1912. So they've been in Marrakech for 2 years, and there's a number of short sections of what their life was there like. So at this point, she's 18, and this is Marrakech 1912. Girls, my father called, I'm waiting. Edith put her hat on as she stepped through the door. Mother reached out and touched her shoulder, an unfamiliar gesture, then turned to me. Alice, don't keep your father waiting, she said. I dropped my umbrella into the porcelain holder, smiled at her, and waved my goggles as I headed for the car. Don't run, she called after me. A lady doesn't run. This lady does, I laughed, opening the car door. Edith and I sat in the back seat, dusters over our dresses, hats on our heads, and goggles over our eyes. Edith hated wearing them, but Mother insisted the Moroccan sun would ruin our eyesight. I loved them. I felt exotic in my 18-year-old body and ready for anything with my goggles on. Father sat in front, speaking loudly and slowly to the fellow who had come to replace our regular driver. We waved to Mother standing on the front steps, and I fell back against the seat when the driver started up abruptly, obviously unfamiliar with the machine. We were heading out to visit a client of Father's. It was blazing hot, and as we passed the Medina, I envied the people in their light layers of gauze. My linen dress and heavy duster may have kept the soil from the road off me, but I was too warm, and I unbuttoned my collar to get some breeze on my neck. When we left the city and moved up into the surrounding hills, the air cooled a bit, and Father told me to sit still. But I kept turning around in my seat to see the city. After 2 years, I still relished the long vistas, the open expanses of light and color. The road became a dirt track once we crossed the bridge, but the driver did not slow down. The dust became so thick we kept our heads down and wrapped our scarves over our mouths to keep the grit out of our teeth. I could see panic in Edith's eyes. She leaned forward to tap Father on the shoulder and motion that we should slow down. He turned to the driver and made an effort to yell something, but the fellow never even turned his head. My father reached out and put his hand on the driver's arm. I saw the reflex action, saw the driver jerk his arm away, turning the steering wheel sharply to the left. And I saw, before it even happened, I saw the car flip over and my sister fly out the side and my father fall like a log into the driver's lap. And I saw the windshield shatter and my goggles fly up in my face and the sky and sand change places before me. But I didn't feel a thing, not a thing. My first sensation was of silence. No voices, no motor, no wind, just immense silence. I was on my side, my arm thrown across my face. I moved my fingers, then my toes, then my legs. I pushed my arms into the sand to raise my body and turned my head. The car was upside down. My sister's bonnet was sitting on the upturned wheel as if she had casually placed it there while she stepped away. When I stood and moved forward, I heard a groan, and thinking it was my father, I ran to the other side of the car where I found the driver lifting himself up from the ground. I shrieked when I saw my father's arm sticking out from under the car. I dug my hands under the side of the car trying to lift it. I shouted and clawed until I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked up at the driver, who pulled his hand away but kept it out to me. The sun directly behind him outlined his hair and body. I do not remember what happened next. I have had plenty of time, plenty of days and hours, even years, to bring back that scene. But all I can recover is the driver holding my hand as we walked, bent forward in the wind. I don't know how long we walked. I didn't know what happened to my father and sister. I told myself that they were dead. It was the only way to step forward in life. It was the only way I could have walked off into the desert hand in hand with a man I had never met and whose language I could not speak. I had left home that morning in Marrakech, a proper 18-year-old British girl, dressed in white, covered in a pale blue duster. Within 24 hours, I was orphaned, bereft of hat and gloves, standing in front of what I could only assume was an oversized bird. Before me rose a full-throated vision of dusty expanse, a head of the deepest blue imaginable, and eyes that sparkled in their sockets. The driver pulled at me roughly, put his hands on my shoulders, and began jabbering to this mythological being before us. Only then did I connect the dusty robes to the swirling blue above and realize the eyes were human. The figure swathed in material that rose and fell as a hand reached out and took hold of the driver's arm. Once again, the driver began jabbering, cackling, the only recognizable sounds, the inshallah, that broke out every few seconds. The person before us raised his head the slightest degree and tightened his hold on the driver's arm. It was like watching someone turn a radio dial. The driver's voice diminished with each press of the hand until he stood mute beside me. Only then did the blue man turn his eyes to mine. The driver fell to his knees, babbling and bowing, clearly begging for mercy. I stood alone in the sand and looked directly at the man before me. I know now that he was startled by that he had thought I was mad, driven to the edge by my journey into the desert. I think now I was never as sane as I was in that moment. And then we moved back in time to London and to her speaking with her husband about what's happening. And then we moved back into the desert for a few stretches. So that's the point where we start weaving in and out.
Cecilia, I mentioned in the introduction that you were in the Peace Corps, and did that experience living in a different culture? I think you were in Africa.
Botswana.
Yes. So did that impact, what some of these scenes and being, a young American? Well, I think you were not a child when you went into the Peace Corps.
No, I was not young.
But did that inspire some of that? I mean, did that have any influence at all on your writing, do you think?
I didn't think so as I was writing it, but when I read it now, it most definitely did. Even though I had written many passages about Alice arriving in the desert, I think that in revision, when I would go back in and write, I mean, full disclosure, you were in the Peace Corps too.
Yes.
and when you are literally, even though you are, we have quote, quote, training, when you are driven out into the bush and dropped off in a village where you don't really speak the language, you don't understand the customs, it's an incredible experience. And And I think that that was something else that Janet and I were going to talk about. She talks a lot about, living in Japan and not understanding the culture, and how there's a real push and pull between wanting to hold on to your own culture and particularly in the Peace Corps, because we're supposedly bringing our culture to them in some respects. But there's also this, you just have to, the only word I can use is absorb. You just have to absorb when you get up in the morning, where you are, who you're with, what's happening. You have to live in a different world, literally. Mindset and body.
When you were reading that, that's what I was thinking of, that first experience into, a village that you didn't know the language very well at that point. You really didn't understand the customs as much as you thought you might. And I can picture this young woman just saying, oh my gosh, and digging her heels in, meeting his eyes, which probably was totally against the customs. And so while it might not have been a Botswana experience or a Thai experience in my case, I think being the other in a different culture can really raise a lot of conflicts within you about what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, and I think you captured that. So it just seemed to me that was a Peace Corps experience, coming into hopefully most of them aren't that violent coming into it and don't have tragedy attached, but
well, thank you, because when you asked before what was hard is having the point of view of Abu. This is the Tuareg and the fact that he thought she was crazy, because when you arrive in a place and you can only rely on your own, what you come from, and it can seem pretty crazy to people.
Yes.
And the mistakes that you make, and so as she progresses, she's just to give people a bit of the story, she's literally rolled in a rug and put on a camel, because she's basically excess baggage, until eventually she becomes a part of the caravan. And then part of it is adapting to the climate, to the world that she's in. And the desert is just, so far removed from London, but it's a beautiful, beautiful experience. And so she is captivated almost more by that. Plus, I think that one of the driving themes is she had much more freedom in the desert than she ever would have had in London. So.
Michael, before we started, we were talking a little bit about revision, and you had some interesting thoughts and questions about that. Do you have anything you're thinking about?
I'm glad you think that they're interesting. I'm a simple poet. I don't generally deal with scenes and character arcs and plot development, and it was marvelous to be able to hear you read from this, Celia, and to feel how fluidly you're able to take the threads of the characters through the different scenes, through the different time periods. I feel smarter now after following you reading them, in exactly the way that I feel smarter when I can watch like a Christopher Nolan film like Memento or Inception, and follow characters through all of these different layers. So that was amazing to me. And I'm curious whether do you carry this all in your head when you're writing? Do you have, one of those crazy whiteboards with, lines drawn between character names in different colors, or is it a sea of Post-it notes? How do you keep track of it while you're writing and then revising it?
I wish I could be that logical and that I don't really keep track of it. This is where, writing residencies were the godsend, because there was one that I went to, and literally they had this like 10-foot table. And I printed out the pages and I lay them, I have a photo of it. I laid them all the way down the table and around. And I literally walked around physically shuffling the pages. So when I didn't have it in my head, I really was, I thank you. I really appreciate what you said, because I think poets are the most incredible writers to distill everything down. I can babble, for scenes and go on, but part of it was distilling the scenes. And then I think when we were going to talk about revision, Janet and I, we were going to give some of our revision techniques. And actually, for me, the best revision question was one that just broke my heart. And, I felt horrible, but I forever thank this person who said to me, "So what?" And every time because I think you can get caught up in what seems like a really fascinating, interesting little scene, but if it doesn't fit with the story, so what is it doing there? So now that's like the acid test for me is, it may be beautiful, it may be lovely, but so what? and it helps, it works. It makes you examine your choices, and it makes you prune away the excess and kill your darlings, as they say.
I think that's great advice for anyone who's writing, because I'm thinking about, when I'm working on a poem, and there are often these lines that I love, and they are just not fitting into the rhythm or, metaphorical or literal rhythm of the poem. And, it is a challenge, but I'm so impressed with your ability to create this world and to describe it. If you think you were babbling at any point, I have some news for you. Nothing was out of place. Everything felt like it locked together in this beautiful, intricate structure. And your eye for detail in the world you were describing is marvelous. And it wasn't just the typical, I saw this, I saw that. It was fully sensory in all aspects. And that's something that I think, a lot of writers don't move out of the visual, but you did, and it is to your eternal credit that the picture of, the London and the desert are both vivid and three-dimensional for me.
Thank you. That is one revision thing, was I stayed in imagination until I had, not even a first draft, like a second draft or a third draft. And I think it was while I was at Lesley that I knew, I have to go to the source. So I signed up for an adventure tour in Morocco with 5 days in the Sahara. And part of that was part of it's not in this piece, but when I got off the plane, and that was a whole story, but it just smells of roses. The entire city is like banks of roses. It's just beautiful. But the first revision was, no, you can't have a car crash and then walk into the desert. There's a bunch of mountains between Marrakech and the desert. And so I had to work around that. And then towards the end, when I was really coming to the final revision, I thought I knew London. I'd been there a few times, and I didn't have things on the wall, but I did have a map of London on the wall. And I was walking at the end of the book. She is walking around London. That's a whole other piece of the story. And so I was, mapping out where she went. And then I had the chance to go visit a friend. And I thought, well, I'm going to walk the route. And when my phone had hit 20 miles, I thought, maybe a 78-year-old woman's not going to take this route. So I literally had to figure out, I changed where she lived and where her studio was and where his office was, because they're both sort of wandering around in the city. And so that was a major revision.
I will bet that was a huge revision. And it also opens up another conversation or another avenue of conversation for me, which is, these characters are your creation, they live in your head, but the world they're in is recognizable. You clearly did research beyond just walking the route and taking an adventure tour that sounds like a really wonderful thing, especially after a year of not going anywhere.
Yes. Oh.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about your research. Before we started, you talked a little bit about, reading books from the time period, but, where did you even start? How did you wrap your head around it?
I started, and I think I've said this in some other readings, I didn't even know who the Tuareg were when I was writing this Alice story. And I don't know if I was channeling or hallucinating, but I had her in the desert, and I had camels, and I had a tribe. And there was a woman in a workshop that I'd gone to who was French. And the French know the Tuaregs because the French colonized a lot of the Sahara. And she said to me, "Oh, you're writing about the blue men." And I said, "Oh, who are the blue men?" And so then that's where I began. And I became fascinated by these people. And, there's so many, sometimes when you're, I don't know if you want to call it coincidence or serendipitous, but when you have something in your head and things just keep happening that are filling in, and here's this, my character is a pretty willful young woman. She obviously doesn't fit into Edwardian England. And here's this tribe that's actually a matriarchy, and the women hold power. And the women, if they can divorce a man by saying goodbye, they hold property, and they are the poets and the keepers of the culture. So it all fit, even though I didn't know who they were to begin with. And then to answer your question, I read a lot of history and found a fascinating fellow. I actually emailed with him a little bit. He teaches at the military college. His name is Douglas Porch, and he had written 2 books about the conquest of Morocco and the conquest of the Sahara, which, military stuff is not that funny, but it was, the French were carrying red wine into the desert, and it was going bad. And, they tried to build a railroad across the Sahara, which, that wasn't going to work. So there are a lot of things in which, the white man or the colonists were arriving and just trying to impose their life in just ridiculous ways. And then there's also the part of the Tuaregs are, they're warriors. They would be outlaws. It'd be like for us, the Wild West cowboys, or, the bandits. So that's a part of their culture. And so that was a little hard to write about the violence, but we all have it in us.
I am so shocked, because when I read this, I was like, I just assumed that you had a long time fascination with this culture, with that tribe, and that's where it began. And so to hear that you made it up first and then found, a people to match it is fascinating.
Well, and it's as I said, things kind of, drop in your lap. And I never laid eyes on a camel and didn't know anything about camels, but I love llamas, and llamas are a camel of the cameloid family. And when I got to the Sahara, I had written a scene in which camels' eyelashes interlock, and they do. So somehow I knew that, but I did not know what it was like to ride a camel, and that's something to be experienced.
So I think we only have a few minutes. Does anybody else have any questions? Go ahead.
Marjorie, hi.
Celia, congratulations. It's just such a joy to hear the words and the flow and just the gorgeous writing, and
Thank you.
having a fellow student through the Lesley program in the same cohort. I know how long you've been working at this and how hard you've been working at it. So my question, apart from revision technique, how did you continue? What ended up being important for you as a way to sustain you until you felt that until you did complete this project? What got you through those ups and downs, and how did you sustain yourself, or what was it about the project that kept compelling you to move forward? I'm just curious about what tremendous force of will and commitment it took to achieve this, and thank goodness you did see it the whole way through. And I'm just wondering what you credit for that.
That's a good question, because as I said, it was like a stray cat that kept showing up at the door, and eventually you let it in, and then you feed it, and then you kind of fall in love with it and you take care of it. And that was sort of, the story just kept growing and growing. And then I would every once in a while, I'd just hit a wall, and or something in my personal life would change, and I just put it aside. And I often think now, when I look at it, that I had to do a little growing before I could go back to the story. Because if you want to believe in tapping into the unconscious or the subconscious, there are scenes that I wrote early on that were scary, and to me even, and that just made no sense or anything. And then and I wasn't able to fit them in or figure out where they fit in the jigsaw puzzle until later. But what kept me going was I wanted to find out what happened, because I really was literally following these characters around. And that, when you were asked the question, I was trying to think, because there usually is a point at which the story, I sometimes use the analogy of pottery, that, you can be working the clay and working the clay, but then at some point you have to decide, is this a plate, or is this a bowl, or is this a vase? And so there is a point at which, and I think for me, the point was when I, again, when the Martin character, and I knew that he was going to be investigating what had actually happened. And then I had to work to make that fit. So that's when I went from just, following her around on the page to trying to make something out of it. Mm-hmm. So where did I get the will? Stubborn. Just, and, I had nothing. I loved this character, and the story was, for some reason, pushing me. But when I was in grad school, and I remember a professor sort of making fun of another professor who was in a field that wasn't all that, revered. And then this person became really essential with their study. And he said, well, if a fool persists in his folly. So I just keep thinking I persisted in my folly.
Well, we're glad you did. We're very glad you did.
Thank you.
So I think that's it for tonight, but we really thank you so much for sharing your book with us and that experience. And
thank you so much.
And being so flexible with this sudden change of the itinerary, but these things happen.
Yeah, it was absolutely.
No, thank you so much. Well, I appreciate that. And I really appreciate Lesley putting all of this together, and can't wait to read your work, all of you. And I see Nancy there too. So I hope we're going to be reading her soon. So
Well,
thank you all.
I'm dropping in the chat the link to Cambridge Common Writers, which is the Lesley MFA Alumni Association. If you are not already part of it and you're a Lesley grad, come to our website, reach out. We would love to be in touch with you. We'd love to hear what you're up to. And we are having a town hall meeting for Lesley MFA grads tomorrow night. And if you are free, we'd love to see you there. It's just an opportunity to kind of meet the board, put some faces to names, and give us some feedback on what you're looking for, what you want, and how we can be better support to you in your writing career. So thank you again, Celia, for a wonderful, wonderful reading tonight. And
Thank
I just
you.
want to say you read beautifully. I mean,
Oh, thank you.
you know, I listen to a lot of poets read, and I wish some of them read more like you. So that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. That's one thing I have to say has been such a shock doing these readings. When you talk about revision, I will be reading and I will be editing as I write. I'm like, oh no. It never ends, I'm sure. But thank you all very much. And Michael, I'm so glad to know you're a neighbor. We'll have to get together.
Yeah, I'm going to be fully vaccinated soon, and am looking to leave the house. So,
Good. Okay.
thank you all. Be well, and we'll see you at another Cambridge Common event soon, I hope.
Thank you. Bye, Marjorie.
Thank
Bye, Nancy.
you.
Bye, Mary. Thank you.
Bye-bye.